It's 25 to 9. A very good morning to you. Welcome to breakfast. Stephen and Anne will be back this time next weekend. We're just sitting in for them. Instead, keeping you company until 10 o'clock this morning. But let's kick off now by having a look at the front pages.
Yeah, starting with the the PM and Chancellor Rishi Sunak are facing a mutiny, according to the paper anyway, after the pair were criticised for Britain's ongoing cost of living crisis.
A poll conducted by the Daily Mail says Boris Johnson will lose the next general election if he does not get a grip on the rising cost of living.
In the Telegraph, the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has told the paper that NATO may arm Moldova in an effort to fight Russia's progress in the surrounding area.
The Daily Mirror is leading on Chancellor Rishi Sunak and his wife's combined £730 million fortune. That puts Rishi Sunak into the UK's 2022 rich list.
And finally, in the Telegraph, the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has, as we've already told you, said that she may get NATO to give some arms to Moldova anyway.
Worth repeating.
Worth repeating, I think, yeah.
Let's go through the papers. Joining us again in the studio is political editor of HuffPost UK, Kevin Schofield, and also journalist Ella Wheeler. It's been a real pleasure to have you both this morning. Kevin, let's start with you if we can. We've just been talking a little bit about the pandemic, the impact on that, how it's upheaved our lives, but we're getting back into the office. In some departments, that's causing a little bit of a problem.
Yeah, so as we've all read about, Jacob Rees-Mogg is cracking a whip a little bit. He wants civil servants to get back to the office. Now, the Department for Education, they had a league table, and basically they were the worst performer, if you want to look at it that way. There was only 25% occupancy back in their department. Now, Nadeem Zahawi is the Secretary of State for Education. He decided, right, enough of that, and he issued an edict saying, you've all got to come back in. Now, the problem there is that pre-pandemic, occupancy levels at the DFE were only about 60 to 70% because they were quite progressive when it comes to flexible working. Now it's 100%, they've all got to come back in, and there aren't enough desks. Basically, they've got twice as many staff as they have desks. So these civil servants are now having to work in corridors and in the staff canteen because of this, being forced to come back. So there's more of them in now than there were pre-pandemic, and they just don't have the capacity. So
it hasn't been thought through, has it?
You're saying politics over practicality?
Yeah, I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg is trying to make a bit of a name for himself, as, he's leaving post-it notes on people's desks, little letters saying, sorry you weren't here, bit passive-aggressive.
What do you think about the principle, though? Do we work more effectively if we're all sat together rather than some people at home on Zoom?
It's a case-by-case basis, isn't it? Some jobs...
What do you do in your office?
Well, because I work in Parliament, it's easier. Your job is... You do your job better, basically, if you're in Parliament, because that's how you meet MPs, you meet advisors, civil servants. But in my last job, I wasn't working in Parliament, and it didn't really make much difference to me whether I was working at home or not. I was fortunate. We live in a house, and we've got a garden, and when the kids were at school, it wasn't too bad, so you were able to do what you can do. But if you're a young person and you're maybe sharing a flat and your office is also your bedroom, I can understand why they're desperate to get back to the office.
Yeah.
So I think it's horses for courses.
Ella, you're a young person. What do you make of that?
Well, it's as Kevin says, it is a case-by-case basis, and also there's a difference between flexible working, which means you might have an arrangement, particularly for parents, that you have a certain amount of time that you work from home, certain amount of time you work in the office to meet childcare needs or whatever, then a kind of a policy which we did, the civil service some civil servants haven't exactly covered themselves in glory of late. We know that, for example, that a lot of the hold-up within the Foreign Office relating to the exit from Afghanistan and the issue of people going home and not answering emails and things like that. So there has been a problem with, particularly in very serious and important roles, whether it is, working within government. It seems to me pretty obvious that you need to be in the mix, and you need to be within the minister's reach. And, if you work at a paper or indeed in an events organisation, I do at the Academy of Ideas, it's impossible to do anything on Zoom because you can't bounce ideas off each other. But, there are lots of people who, particularly, I'm conscious of thinking of, during a cost of living crisis, there's lots of people who might be thinking, well, if I can do my call centre job from home or whatever without spending £400 on a season ticket for the train to get into central London to an office that is miserable most of the time anyway, and I'm sat on a headset. Why not? So I think we should sort of think innovatively about it. But I'm not on Jacob Rees-Mogg's side in terms of this sort of blind crack in the whip and in a passive-aggressive way, as Kevin says. But I think there is a sense of, public life is public life and home life is home life, and we should maintain some kind of distinction there, if not least to kind of keep our sanity.
Yeah, page 17 of the Times, there's a transgender row, school debate raised after pupils' comments. What's this all about?
So if people haven't been following this, I'll just explain, because it's a complicated one. What happened was an unnamed baroness went to speak at a school about, she was a Stonewall champion, speaking about the issue of trans rights, and in particular was, as it sounds, quite critical of gender-critical feminists and giving a particularly one-sided view on the kind of trans row. Fair enough. And then one of the pupils decided to ask her a question and take her up, and one of the questions she asked said was, well, how are you going to have kind of cross-party consensus in this, in the Lords, if you don't agree, if you are saying that people are morally incompatible? The other baroness is naming another unnamed baroness who disagrees, who goes along with the gender-critical line. And as a result, rather than that just being a good spirit of debate, that young girl was there was a spat, as it's been described, the one who raised the objection. There was a spat in the sixth form common room. She was
with other pupils,
attacked by other pupils, criticised. That escalated into what people are describing as bullying. And rather than intervening and saying, come on, girls, we can all disagree in a civil manner, the school seems to have taken the side of those students who were criticising the other student for being critical. This all sounds a bit complicated, but essentially she's been forced out of school for asking questions about the trans rights debate. That seems to me pretty bad, and there has the Times has reported earlier on in the week, and it's reporting that people like J.K. Rowling and other prominent feminists who have voiced gender-critical views or gender abolitionist views have come out in support of her. And I think it just raises an important question, which is, can we have these kind of debates at school? You absolutely can, and particularly if you're an adult, I've done it many times, going in to give a lecture at school, you understand and should be willing to accept questions from kids that might challenge you. And what you want to leave the students with is a sense of, you can debate the most difficult issues in society civilly without it turning into a kind of hair-pulling exercise in the sixth form common room. So the school seems to have really failed that commitment to debate, and also this student in this instance.
Do you think we've actually worked out how to have this debate? Because it's one with high emotion, whether that happens in the public sphere on Twitter or in the classroom.
No, we quite clearly haven't, and it's interesting you mentioned Twitter. I think maybe outside the realms of social media, certain newspapers, it's not an issue that has really caught the public consciousness. But what was interesting, I think, was through the weekend, Ella mentioned it earlier, that Boris Johnson, unannounced or unprovoked in the during Prime Minister's questions, had to go at Keir Starmer saying he can't say what a woman is. And clearly it is an issue that the Conservatives think is something that is going to be politically advantageous for them in the run-up to the next general elections. I think we will get to hear more about it. Labour are obviously in a bit of a difficult spot over it. The Conservatives are a bit more aligned, although not completely unanimously. So it is something that's going to develop into an issue, I think, that we'll be hearing a lot more about in the run-up to the next election.
Let's talk about the run-up to the next general election. The Telegraph, page 20, debate, is Boris in for a tough general election? If the front page of I think it was the Daily Mail was to be believed, if it doesn't deal with the cost of living crisis, then absolutely yes.
Well, yeah, so the Telegraph have done a big, massive double-page spread on, is it 1997 all over again? There's a lot of, for some reason, a lot of nostalgia around 1997 at the moment. It's 25 years ago. I was listening to Radio 6 Music yesterday, and it was all about OK Computer, which is 25 years old.
Great album.
Great album, and they played 1997 music all day long, so maybe there's something else to discuss there. But yeah, they're looking at, there's a lot of sleaze around at the moment, as there was in the dog days of the John Major administration. They're saying, could this herald not a 1997 style landslide, but does this mean that the Tories are on the way out, that Labour, that Keir Starmer is going to be the next Prime Minister? No one would seriously compare Keir Starmer with Tony Blair. They're completely different standard of politician, I think. However, there are certainly eerie similarities. You've got, as I say, a an administration at the moment that is lurching from crisis to crisis. They're behind in the polls. The economy isn't going well. The Conservatives have lost their reputation for economic competence in the same way that John Major did because of Black Wednesday. So, you know, there are some years.
2 years, though, is a long time. You know, we're away from a general election. And when you look at the build-up to 97, the Conservative support ebbed away and Labour was making gains.
Yeah.
We're not in that situation. This would take a huge, monumental swing away from the Conservatives. So if the Conservatives were worried about that, would they not be being paranoid androids?
Yeah, I see what you did there. Yeah, I mean, it would take a massive swing for Labour to get a majority at the next election, not least because they've lost Scotland in the way that used to send 40 MPs in from Scotland, that they don't do that anymore. However, it wouldn't take that much for the Tories to lose their majority and for there to be some sort of Labour-led minority administration, coalition, rainbow coalition of various left or centre parties. So, you know, I think that the Tories that I speak to are genuinely worried. You know, they think that the shine has gone off Boris Johnson, the public are now fed up with them because of Partygate and various other things, and that unless something dramatic happens, then they're going to struggle to turn that around.
Well, one piece of drama has, of course, been war in Ukraine, and Boris Johnson's actually been quite praised for his actions there, the visits that he's spent, the time he's had with Zelensky. Let's just look at the front page of the Telegraph, if we can, Ella, and the interview they've done with Liz Truss about the intervention and perhaps the military spending to Moldova.
Yeah, very prime ministerial kind of picture there of Liz Truss on the front. Make of that what you will. But there's, you're right, the one thing that hasn't been mired in scandal has been the UK support for Ukraine and opposition to Russia's invasion. And Liz Truss seems to be wanting to up the ante there, as she has done actually successfully throughout this crisis and throughout the war. She's often been sort of seemingly one step ahead of the rest of the cabinet in suggesting further intervention. And she's, you know, it isn't crazy what she is suggesting. She's suggesting that Moldova, a NATO country, be brought up to NATO standard in terms of its military support, that rather than having Soviet-era weaponry, it be, you know, the fighters there be trained in apprehension of and in suspension of a Russian invasion. And where she seems to be going a little bit further is that while most people have recognised that Russia's military efforts in Ukraine haven't been doing as well as they thought it would, of course we know this is Putin is an unpredictable character, and just because he's losing in some places doesn't mean he'll push on in others. But she's really pushing the line that it's inevitable that Russia is going to expand into, that it has expansionist targets that it's going to push into Moldova. And really, I think, other than just the security of a country like Moldova, indeed we've seen discussions about Sweden and Finland over the last week joining NATO. There is I think not knee-jerk, but I think any politician has to take into account what the long-term consequences of action like this is going to be. And that's not to say that you get held hostage by Putin by saying, he says I'll do X, Y, and Z if NATO expands, and so we better not. No, you don't want to be held hostage by an autocrat like that. But at the same time, the kind of bifurcation of this conflict via a sort of strengthened NATO and Russia at the end of this war, whenever it happens, isn't a very positive future either. And so I think we just need to keep a careful eye on these kind of moves, whether it be discussions from the US of hints of the desire for regime change, or kind of questions of how the UK can, if you were to be ungenerous, grandstand on the international stage by calling for further intervention, because this is a significant ramping up of military intervention, to just be approached with caution, I think.
Yeah, what do you think, Kevin? Because Moldova, there's an area of Moldova called Transnistria where there are already like 1,500 Russian troops. And that's why a lot of people think, and also because it's a former Soviet state, it's not in the EU, and as Ella said, it's not a member of NATO, so it could very well be a Russian target in future.
Yeah, I think what was interesting as well is if the whole point of the invasion from a Vladimir Putin perspective was to try and create this greater Russia and halt NATO expansion, it's completely backfired. You've got Finland and Sweden now talking about or applying to join NATO. You've now got Liz Truss clearly not freelancing. She'll have got agreement that NATO countries are going to arm Moldova as well. as I say, it is backfired. It's actually brought more, brought the West together rather than actually splitting the West apart, as I think Vladimir Putin had hoped.
Yeah.
Kevin, Ella, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you both very much for spending the morning with us here on Breakfast on GB News. We'd love your views on any of these stories. Please do feel free to chime in at any point. gbviews@gbnews.uk.